for those eagle eyes people who were looking at the promo images for our lore deep dive today, you saw this lovely calling card here, beautifully rendered by one Briarwick. And there's a lot of things going on in this image, which could be interesting to pick apart. So the first thing that you see here in terms of like the text is the Sublime Order of Metasis. Now, we've been referring to a certain faction as the Church for a while, and we had finally sat down and hashed out a lot of the background lore for this particular religious-oriented faction, I guess. So, does someone want to talk about exactly kind of what's going on with this Sublime Order of Metasis? Like, why are they called that? What are they about? Jason, do you want to like give kind of like a high level overview of, you know, what this faction is kind of about?
Yeah, sure. So I think for a long time, pretty much from the start, we knew we wanted a religiously oriented faction. I think in any kind of old worldy fantasy kind of world, it's pretty much a staple, right? That there's some kind of religious institution, and the world of Steamhounds is really no different. And over time, we've gradually narrowed in on specifically what the nature of that faction is and what their whole aesthetic is, I suppose. So we knew we wanted this group who were kind of a fairly well-established kind of influence in the world, but in more modern times, they're maybe losing a bit of their cultural influence, and they're struggling to kind of keep that up, and maybe playing a bit dirty in order to do so. And I think it's probably since we started working with Fen on some of the visuals and aesthetics for this that the whole sublimation, like vapor thing came into this. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I'd say so. I'd say like the key thing that when I first kind of joined the project is this, like, you know, the guys wanted this kind of like religious faction, but I kind of liked this idea that you know, there's always this kind of like, you know, narrative in like real world that it's like religion versus science, and I thought it'd be a kind of cool way maybe to just marry these two kind of ideas together. So as we'll kind of discover with all the stuff that we're going to show off, is that they're kind of a bit of both. So they've got this facade of religion, but they've actually kind of got deep ties to kind of like science and medicine, to maybe be a bit more unique than the kind of original, or just kind of like the expected approach of this, like, you know, these guys are like religion or church, hence why we've got like this medicist name and whatnot.
Yeah,
So
I think
Yeah.
mostly what this faction is about is blurring the lines in between what is ritual and what is like science, I guess, so to speak. And kind of like in blurring that line, this faction is all about making what they do about kind of like a lifestyle, kind of like it's like an all-encompassing thing where one of their main things here, with that little sample right there, is this liquid, this is vapor, there's kind of like a panacea for the most part, which assumedly does have some medicinal properties of a sort, um, or at least it does something, but it's, you know, it's very much upsold. Like one department of this faction that is not hurting at all is the marketing department, as their amazing little calling card is it's they've got a lot of things going on here, free samples, nice iconography and all that kind of stuff. So they're not suffering in that respect. But yeah, go ahead, Jason.
This also ties back to religion in our world, right? Like originally science basically was a branch of religion, right? Like astronomy, that was all done by folks at the Vatican, and like even scientific research was originally, it was basically part of religious doctrine, or it was all done in the context or the assumption that we're trying to understand God's creation and stuff like that. So it's not like a thing we've entirely made up.
Yeah.
But we've definitely really run with the concept of if the church holds on to control of science, then how does it hold us back from having the kind of scientific revolution and actually kind of moving forward beyond that? So yes, they've brought us medicine and they've developed a load of stuff, but then the fact that they're kind of held back by all this dogma and ritual kind of then puts the brakes on actually developing past a certain point. That's kind of the force that the church is in the world in a way.
Yeah, which that could be fine for, that could be fine for the order, but is that good for society? You know what I mean? Because they've kind of like rooted themselves in providing something for people, but if they're preventing things from quote like getting better for society as a whole, then that's kind of like a point of friction maybe. But
Yeah.
yes, so what else can we pick apart from this one image right here? We've talked about
So
this little free sample here.
the naming of this stuff.
What'd you say?
There's a lot of wordplay in the naming.
Oh,
There's a lot of
yeah.
wordplay in the naming of this faction. The whole sublimation, which is when a liquid kind of turns into a vapor. It's this whole. It all kind of ties in together with this aesthetic of this green, liquidy, steamy stuff, which is probably pretty much Ulfen's contribution. That whole the kind of color palette and whole thing of this
Yeah,
faction. Did that start with the character, or I'm trying to remember
yeah,
back to how that all came about?
it did. So as like for you guys that play the game, you'll know that the chemist has both like healing abilities and also like damaging like abilities. So that was key for just the design of like the chemist himself. However, we kind of liked this like the color palette that he had, and he seemed like the way that he was designed was be to fit into some form of faction, or at least he shared ties to a faction. Again, I'm sure that's something we'll talk about in a bit. But when we kind of went on after that to kind of be like, okay, we want to maybe work on a bit of these like factions, I basically took the color palette that we had from the final design of the chemist and kind of worked that into like a few sketches, a few logos, and it just kind of worked together. The same with again with the logo. We haven't really talked about the logo, um, but the logo also stemmed from the chemist design. So that kind of like YT cross is uh, used a lot in his kind of visual design as a character. So you'll find it in like his canister shapes, his crown shapes, his kind of overall pose. And it was like the first design that I did for the guys, and it's somehow carried all the way through, and is like really defined like the faction itself. So it's always quite funny how I look back at this and kind of just see that like one kind of cross that I did was literally like I drew a cross, like normal religious Christian cross, and I was like, well, I can't use this, and then split it off instead to kind of show that kind of duality again of them kind of going two different paths. So yeah.
Yeah, and that's really it's funny from like one like concept art image how far you can really pull
Yeah.
like all those concepts all the way through. Like, yeah, this is a character that's supposed to be associated at least with part of a faction, and just like drawing from their design, like how like you're kind of like going backwards. It's like, okay, like how did they derive their whole persona from the faction that they're supposed to be associated with? Kind of like fill in those blanks about like how they were influenced. That exactly what you said with this kind of like YT shaped kind of iconography being like repeated in multiple places, just pulling that back and using that as like the basis for the faction itself.
Yeah. Yeah, because constraints are good for like the guys have always wanted like very distinct factions for the game. It was like something that was like on the table, and like one of the first meetings that I had, like to talk about design and like concept art with them. So for me, that's stuff that I really enjoy doing, is making stuff like kind of tied together with like design thematics, whether that's like shape language, color palettes, any kind of like iconography, motifs, all that kind of stuff. I have to be very consistent, and being consistent is like, as Andrew said, kind of working backwards with this kind of thing. Like you take one thing and then you kind of push it as far as you can. And it all just kind of lends into each other, that hopefully going forwards, like hopefully with all the stuff we're going to show today, you can kind of go, yeah, this is all consistent. This all looks like it's part of one faction. It's very distinctive. It's very,
Yeah.
you
It
know that
probably
it's the church. Or Submus, sorry.
it probably helps as well that the chemist is clearly some kind of like priest or like outwardly visible member of this faction. It's kind of a uniform they're wearing, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So many aspects of the faction naturally would be built into their kind of image. So in designing the chemist, you're kind of forced to define a lot of things about this faction. So it all kind of falls naturally out of that.
Yeah.
Plus, then you have a tendency to make things make sense, and there's always a reasoning behind like the little mechanisms and the devices. So
Yeah.
I feel like you can't help but have an internal logic to this, and then
Yeah.
it gives us hooks to kind of build a wider faction around.
Yeah, I feel like if things don't have rules, then everything just gets a little bit messy. Like, I'm very strict on the color palettes between the two factions that we have at the moment, and I have like internal color palettes for future factions if we ever get around to doing like the other ones that we have plans to do. So you know, you're going to kind of constantly see this kind of like brass, green, and like red ceramic marbly kind of colors for the church. Like that's my internal lore and like design philosophy for them.
It even ties back to the kind of bone, the kind of skull image from that first emblem as well. It's kind of similar to the, I don't know what you'd call it, the upper part of the chemist's gear there, kind of over their torso. It's all kind of ties in together. So
and the deer is obviously very important that we'll get to.
Yeah, should we talk about the deer?
Let's talk about this lovely deer.
How do we want to start with this deer? Like, what order are we going to do it in?
The Sublime Order, of course. So,
I think.
Sorry, I had to. So let's talk about, like what is going on with. I guess we talked about this kind of symbol, but right here it's a little bit more visible in terms of there being a separated, like there's like this like crossbar in the back of this Y. Is there a particular reason for that? I already know the answer, but I was setting someone up for a slam dunk here.
Is this the whole YT?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. To be fair, that's something I didn't actually intentionally do or think about. Like, but I guess actually drawing it that way makes it pretty obvious, and I should probably do that more going forwards. But yeah, the cross, or this symbol that we liked basically from the beginning, I've always kind of pronounced as like yitre, or yitte. It's like, it's a YT, right? And it didn't have any meaning for, I mean, ages. It was, what, maybe a couple of months ago when we had the lore meetings, and I again felt kind of neurotic that it had to have a meaning. Like, there had to be a reason for this. I think we eventually settled on, or agreed upon, that this deer head and like this YT would be like the deity for the faction that these people supposedly like idolize, called Yatrax. And Yatrax is a kind of like, to tie in with this duality theme, is a kind of nourishing god, but also a kind of like malicious god. So the order is basically saying like, hey, you need to kind of like pray and purge your vices, or this dear god is going to like haunt you and not give you a good time. And I took kind of reference from like Wendigos, if people know what Wendigos are, which are like a kind of they're like I think they're skinwalkers, or they're known as like skinwalkers. They're like kind of ghost-like monsters that appear and kind of like steal your appearance and cannibalize you or something. They're a bit dark. They're a bit dark, but the kind of YT shape kind of lent. I was like, how can I tie this to some kind of deity? And they looked like horns, but I didn't want to do devil horns because that's way too on the nose. But having a kind of like deer antlers, like deers have the kind of like split kind of ways, and yeah, so I kind of ran with the deer head and Wendigos and kind of just pushed that, went that way with it.
Yeah, we're kind of using this
Yeah.
deer
We
as
also have
like
these kind of like
yeah. Go ahead, Jason.
I was going to say we also have these like runic elements. So if you look around the kind of ring around the deer's head, I think for a long time we've had these kind of Scandinavian-y looking or Old English kind of Celtic like runic elements to this as well, which again ties into the name.
Yeah, I think what we kind of like decided upon with what kind of like languages and cultures do we want to draw from in terms of like what is considered old in this world, basically, because the city itself in which this game takes place is, I wouldn't say ancient necessarily, and it's not like the original inhabitants of this area. It is a like a trade settlement first and foremost, like at least it was at one point, before it became more and more of an economic power. And we're like, okay, like what can we draw from in terms of like what what do we want to do in terms of like what's the like indigenous peoples, and like what's kind of like what is the ancient ways, and like what can this religious minded faction kind of draw from in terms of like drawing people into like quote tradition and stuff like that, because there's always this kind of like mystique of about like how the way things were and like old gods and stuff like that, and that kind of gives like authority in a way. So we wanted to pull from something. That's kind of like what we what we decided upon for that. A lot of
It's very
interesting.
much like how, you know, how Christianity has kind of tapped into elements of like old pagan religions and festivals and stuff like that,
Yeah.
as a way to make it more kind of palatable. So I guess the thought is that Trax is maybe derived from or somehow relates to some pre-existing, whatever the equivalent of like an old or like pagan religion in this place would have been. So they've used this as something to kind of attach themselves to in order to give them an in and make it more easy for people to kind of convert over to their worldview, which is very much what happens in the real world.
Yeah,
And
I always
oh, go on, Andrew.
I was gonna say I always saw it as something that's more of an anachronism for the church. Like they like realize that they have to like have something like this in order to be like be taken like legitimately as like something that's been established for a really long time, as opposed to just like telling people that yeah, you want our stuff because it's good for you / we need that. Like this is more of a like there's something else going on here. There's something deeper that we're tapping into to get to make people feel something about what we're doing.
Yeah, or even just for there to be a figurehead that makes it easy to like steer things and say, you know, if you're going to impose and say religions want to impose rules and have their moral laws and their moral authority, and just being able to do medical stuff and do magical stuff isn't quite enough.
Yeah.
There needs to be some authority to like attach that to give it legitimacy, and this Trax is that essentially.
Yeah. And
maybe we can talk a little bit. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the only like might need to point out that like the vials and the little mouth bit again, because it looks overall like a kind of religious symbol, but at the same time I needed to hint at that they also are more like sciencey, and they have that kind of like, you know, medical property. So the overall kind of like, it's supposed to look like a kind of effigy, but at the same time it's actually more of a medical syringe.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of marrying those ideas again overall.
Yeah, I don't know how deep we want to get into the kind of like origin lore of
Yeah.
of this symbol. But I think it's interesting here because this substance, this green substance here, is definitely something that looks like this deer is providing, because that's what's coming out of its mouth essentially. And if you also pretty obviously it's the same color as these horns here. So it's got that theme of like which is also like another like Christian thing, which is like providing something of your own body for people essentially. And without going into too much detail, we want to hide a little bit about the inner workings of the mystique here, but this is also cementing like that Etrax is also the provider of what makes the church work basically. But yeah, we can be a little vague on that probably.
Yeah.
That's actually a pretty cool thing that we want people to figure out as they play the game. But there's a reason why this is like an all-encompassing god. It's not just like a destroyer and a taker away of things. It's also a provider of sorts.
Yeah.
And a fun little thing. I don't know how much detail we've gone into the actual substance before on our streams. But we've talked about like, what is this substance? What does it do? How is it used? And Jason, you have like a pretty good, like, I'm sure you can come up with a pretty good summary about how this substance regularly by the order.
Yeah, so there is a substance, which I guess we're not going to talk about
Yeah.
all the details about the origin of it, but it's something that we can talk about, like the visible manifestation of that, which is how this stuff is distilled and processed and manufactured into various forms, right? So there's this green substance, which you normally see as a liquid, or sometimes it will kind of sublimate literally into a vapor.
There's a point of correction. Sublimation is going from solid to vapor immediately.
From a solid, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wait, so we might be giving away something
right,
else
okay.
by
That
saying
doesn't
that, but we're all good.
Yeah. But yeah, so it's normally you see it in these big kind of tubes, or like the chemist has these vats kind of on their back.
Yeah.
So it's kind of distilled and processed and mixed with other stuff into compounds which are used for various different purposes. So some of them are just straight up medicines and anesthetics, things like that. In other contexts, they can be kind of corrosive, right? Like the chemist has some kind of acidic type abilities.
Yeah.
And there are other things. There's the whole kind of mind-altering aspect of this.
Yeah.
Which I guess we can talk about a little bit.
Yeah, totally.
Do we have any of the images which show some of the big vats and stuff like that?
Yeah, yeah. I think we do. Yeah, we have a couple of things. Let me put it up real quick. I think we have.
And maybe you can talk about the aesthetic of what a church facility, sorry, what an order like facility or building would look like inside.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is one of the like initial sketches that I did for kind of like the Sublimists like headquarters. I think we kind of like decided that they have a very powerful impact on the city, but they have a very kind of like small like area of influence. Like they have maybe like one kind of big like headquarter with smaller kind of like buildings dotted around and whatnot. And their main place of like order, I'd imagine being like a kind of combination between like a kind of church building, but also like a brewery, where they kind of have to use their space kind of like quite deceivingly. So they kind of like almost like kind of stained glass windows. They kind of like promote like all this kind of like architecture as like, worship this god or you will be like in trouble. But in reality, it's actually they're synthesizing and creating all these like medicines like directly in front of the punters. We thought that was quite interesting. But do we have the image of like Briarwick's? Yeah, okay, the ziggurat.
Yeah, I'm ahead of you.
Yeah. Our other illustrator, Briarwick, was assigned to do like this kind of like other calling card. And it's she came up with this idea of a kind of ziggurat, more of a pyramid styled kind of cathedral, and it's incredible. I think we all love it like a lot, and it kind of married again those ideas that this like the green that you can see is supposed to also be like kind of vats, like kind of very thick kind of planes of glass that are filled with this like green noxious liquid, and chemicals and whatnot to add to that like divine look. So you can imagine that these kind of like glowing glass planes would like emanate, that you'd kind of be able to see from like all across the city of Steamhounds. And yeah, it's
I think
yeah, go.
so. I think another image we had a long time ago, which we all really liked, was the congregation kind of sitting in the pews, having this stuff like piped to their seats.
Yeah.
So you would
Yes.
sit there during the ceremony with these kind of masks, like gas masks on, and you would huff this
Yeah.
stuff, kind of get high and have
Yeah.
like these visions during the ceremonies. And again, that that ties into a lot of like old school religious stuff. Would have some kind of psychoactive plant or something like that that gets eaten or smoked or whatever. Like that's very, very common in like the history of religion. So that's another thing we wanted to tie in. We just love that image. We thought that was steampunk as hell. Having this like pipe direct
You
to the
could-
pews and everyone kind of tripping
Yeah.
out on this stuff.
Yeah, you can kind of see it in the like at the base of the pillars is almost like a kind of like pump, or like I forget what kind of like system it is. Like you know how like accordions work, like they compress so
Like a
air goes out
bellows
through
kind of
them and
thing.
pipe. Yeah, that was the idea for the kind of like these pillars, where this like liquid would essentially kind of be vaporized and
Yeah.
then like channeled through with these pews and like the kind of piping and decoration that's on them. But it's again, it's supposed to look like religious stuff, but it's all like what's the easiest and most efficient way to get this dose into people. So that's fun.
Yeah.
I always think it's quite fun. I still want to develop their interior design a little bit more. I did a kind of sketch for a fountain that could potentially be found. I don't know if you've got that
Yeah, I've
image
got
on.
that.
Yeah, you got that one.
Yeah.
So I'm personally better at drawing like images or like props individually. I'm not that great, in my opinion, at doing like environments as a whole. It's kind of a bit too much information for me to digest. But kind of doing stuff like this, which is like some kind of like fountain where like punters could come up and get like a dose, or like splash their face with this chemical that's kind of constantly like flowing out. Is I don't know. I like doing this kind of stuff, and I wanted to like explore more architecture and like overall kind of like designs and stuff, doing more stuff like this. So yeah.
I think this also exemplifies a lot of our approach to these factions and the world building in general, which is that we obviously want to like have call outs and references to real world things, but this isn't our world.
Yeah.
So we want to have parallels, but we don't want anything to like specifically match
Yeah.
real like cultural artifacts in our world, right? Like you have these big green vats, which are very much like stained glass windows, like aesthetically,
Yeah.
but they're not. There's something else which kind of has that effect. You have the deer head at the far end of the church with these big horns, which are very much like a pipe organ or something like that.
Yep.
But again, it's not a pipe organ; it's something else that kind of has that like a very obvious parallel, but it's nothing is actually the same.
Yeah.
And this is something throughout. Like whenever we come up with a design and we're like, hang on, that's that object or that something's only that color because it happens to be that color in our world as a historical accident. So let's make it something different, but let's have it connect to something real to make it kind of ring true and feel consistent, but without being seeming out of place or seeming like a part of our world has just been kind of transplanted here. We filter everything through a lens of kind of distorting or reimagining in a plausible but different way.
Yeah. It's been fun. It's been really fun.
So what other subjects do we have, Sublime Order wise?
What
We
else
could
we
talk
got?
about the kind of hallucinogenic stuff and how that relates to the chemist and maybe to the order more broadly. So, Ben, do you want to talk through some of the chemist's abilities? The weird ones?
Sure. The weird
Do you have any
one.
images for do you have the concept sketches for some of those?
I have one of the images for the concept sketches, which is probably the most evocative one. Like from very early stuff. So
If you
if you want to get me some more images, I'm totally cool with that. But
that one's fine. There is the image that's got all of them in, but I mean, this is a good one just to talk about because it explains. I mean, I can talk about it from this one alone. So yeah, this is going to be the flame is it really flame fask?
it is
Have
flame
I did I
flask right now.
really put flame fask?
Hey, close
Goodness
enough.
gracious.
Whatever. You know what's up.
Flame cask for the chemist attack currently. I've kind of redesigned as being corrosive curse. So the idea is that this, as we said, that this substance that is key to the faction can be used in many different ways. One being like hallucinogenic. So we wanted this idea that you could. They are essentially trying to influence and manipulate people's perception. So, like we're saying, like we thought it'd be cool if they could basically cause people to have these like divine interventions. So there's no god per se, there's no deity, like it doesn't actually exist, but they can basically influence people into having these hallucinations of this deity, of like the deer of your tracks, like appearing in like the corner of their eyes, or like at the end of an alley, or they'll see images and smokes and whatnot, and it would be this image because they've been manipulated into believing so. So one of the key abilities of, as I was saying, the chemist being this like flame fast or flame cast that does damage, I thought it'd be cool to kind of like him literally launch a kind of like sculpted like corrosive deer head or skull at people. Just to really tie that home, like, again, pulling back to this idea that the deer head is very, very key to this like faction. Let's try and use it wherever we can. And yeah, it's always kind of cool, kind of like, painting skulls on their own and painting clouds on their own, but trying to paint like deery clouds is very weird. It's very bizarre
Yeah.
and cool.
It kind of has some parallels with like I want to say, was it Sandman from Batman, or like
Scarecrow.
Scarecrow?
Scarecrow,
Sorry,
yeah.
that's the guy.
Scarecrow.
Scarecrow from
Yeah.
Batman, or like in Lord of the Rings, where Gandalf is like shaping smoke into like ships and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Andrew,
yeah,
I'm
like
just sending you the whole set of these abilities in case you're able to
Thank you.
to pull that up.
so
Slack or is this sorry.
the chemist as a whole is very, like, as I've talked about in the art stream, he's very like quite egotistical, but he has the duality of like healing and dealing damage. So he's kind of got this dual nature of like, he's got some happy skills, he's got some very like divine looking seraphic angelic skills that make him look like godly and egotistical, as if he's like the savior that is needed in Steamhounds.
Yes.
But then he has some really nasty abilities that are like wrapping people in thorns and corrosive substances to melt them. There we go. There's the full page.
I
And
really
yeah,
love the tagline for them. It's so good. At the bottom there.
Can people read that as a? I don't know what my quality's like. It might just be. But yeah, I think the key thing that we wanted to really, push with this design, or like one of the first characters, is that there is no magic in Steamhounds. This is all like science and technology kind of like married together. There is no, like, let's make a fireball from our hands. There's nothing like that. However, we thought because like this faction that is, supposed to be kind of portraying or, casting this facade of being a religion, like maybe we can drag some kind of like almost like magician illusions, like how magicians used to kind of like cast light on mirrors, or like they'd be able to project things in smoke to look like stuff. That's kind of their motif on how they manipulate people.
Yeah.
Kind of like technomancy in
Yes.
some ways, which is just like really high tech, like high technology that the masses don't really have access to, and be mistaken as magic by said masses.
Yeah,
and so
exactly.
there's definitely a lot of tech and science, so to speak, that the church knows how to do that no one, like a lot of other people, have no idea like how they're doing it or what they're doing. A lot of people would love to know, and a lot of people are trying to probably figure that out. But to outsiders who don't have that questioning, kind of probing kind of personality, it's probably seen as more like, oh, this is beyond me. This is coming from somewhere else, kind of deal.
Yeah. And the church also the order, which is what we now are supposed to start calling them.
Yeah, it's
tries
hard to
keep that
switch
locked
back
down,
over.
right? Yeah. So they have their inner circles. They have, if you overstep the line on what you're supposed to be messing around with, you'll get ousted or called a heretic or whatever it may be. So they're very much trying to keep a lock on this knowledge, which is part of the reason why they're kind of stunting progress, because if they just opened it up and allowed people to examine it scientifically with all the new technology that exists in the world of Steamhounds in like a more modern era, then there's probably a lot that can be done with that, but it's all very like ritualized and regimented and compartmentalized.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's probably like no one knows, like very few people know the entire secret formula type thing, where like certain areas of the order know about production, certain areas of the order know about the inner workings of the like politics within the organization. Other areas know about how they harvest things, so to speak. So like there's very little centralized information within one person.
Yeah. Hello, I see some fancy icons.
Yeah, I just thought I would bring up these like fancy icons that Fen had made
These
for
are
these
so great.
abilities.
I love these.
They were fun. Were is the key.
In retrospect, they were fun.
Yeah. No, I'm really happy with these icons. I think the chemist icons are still some of my favorite ones. Yeah, I think just because I'm always going to have a preference for chemist. But yeah, they just, again, guys wanted to have some kind of like unique icons for each ability, kind of like how most games have. And it was a cool way to kind of like, because since the game is pixel art, it was nice to kind of have these maybe like smaller illustrations that were like a bit more like realistic, to kind of get more like that kind of imagery in. Like it's easier to kind of maybe see what's happening and whatnot.
Yeah. Another thing is there's so much internal logic to this, like the different hues, the different slightly different green colors that you've got going on here.
Oh yeah, had I not talked about my good greens and bad greens?
Yeah,
Here we
let's
go.
talk
Hey,
about
let's
that.
have the classic talk on good greens and bad greens. So yeah, as you can see, like to kind of keep it visually concise, again because he has both healing abilities and damaging abilities, it was important to kind of like keep this color palette very like condensed, because this all gets translated into pixel art for the actual like gameplay. I don't want to have like a massive color palette which gets really confusing at such a small kind of resolution. So in kind of color theory and like art theory, these kind of more bluey greens, I call them bluey greens, are used in kind of like video game like design to be more like happy. Like this kind of color is used on like shields and healing and those kind of abilities. Like no matter kind of like what game you play, like this is kind of usually like a general rule of thumb. Whilst the kind of yellowy greens, which are the more kind of causticy, damaging greens, are used for kind of like damage over time, poison, toxic abilities. And you know, fortunately, since like I said, this kit has both of those, I can still use this like kind of singular green color, but skew them towards different hues. These being yellow for the damaging abilities or blues for the healing ones, means that I can keep the color palette quite tight and, you know, still be cohesive for, again, not just the chemist himself, but the entirety of the like sublimist order. So again, you should be able to kind of go like, oh yeah, this is a medicist attack or like medicist design or part of that faction. Like you will rarely ever see these kind of colors used in different factions, like unless it's a very like fringe case or something. So
Yeah, even the vats on the chemist's back, right? Like
Yep.
they're not all the same color. Like some of them have the the good stuff, and some of them have the corrosive stuff inside.
Yeah, so like the idea for the chemist is that he is on the fly basically with his gloves. He's kind of got like a kind of device that he's able to kind of like tune and kind of like mix on the fly, like kind of what like ratios of this chemical he wants to mix, which cause different effects. So again, because it's pixel art and it has to be small resolution, I can't explain all this stuff like in details and like rendering out like little buttons and whatnot. It all has to be built into the silhouette, so he controls all this at once with his like hands and fingertip. Yeah, there you go. I was gonna say if we got some gifs of his hand motions. So yeah, his technology is all located in his like gloves and arms, and however he moves his arms, almost kind of like jiu-jitsu or some kind of like
Some Naruto stuff.
yeah, some kind of like narrative stuff. He's able to control like the chemicals that come out, so he's able to kind of like set himself up different like rituals and movements that do specific things. And yeah, he's always he's fun.
Yeah, he's got a lot of really fun abilities right now.
Yeah.
Like pulling up a couple. They're cool.
Yeah, a lot of the chemist abilities are more not so much in their own body, although they have all the cool finger wigglies and stuff going on, but they're more these big projectiles and things which spawn in the world, in contrast to some other characters which are more, you know, it's their own movements and their own weapons and stuff swinging around, whereas chemist has got all this cool atmospheric stuff. And Brady, our pixel artist, is just really good at like fluids and smoke and liquid and all of that stuff. It just, for whatever reason, it always comes out really great when they do it.
I think the reason is because they're talented and they're really good at their craft, Jason. So
yes.
Let's go with that. My thing. Oh. You just have a nice a little blessing there. Wonder if people can get what that's gonna be in the game. Certain focus ability. But
I still need to try out in commander mode.
That's true. That's very true. But yeah, so that was kind of a really deep look at the current status of the chemist right now. But let me bring up.
You got it, my Neve. That's it.
Exactly. I'm just gonna bring up like an older image here of some like character concepts that we had, just like general, just like what do members of like the church order kind of like, what do members of the order kind of look like? This is kind of like an older thing. Might see one particular sketch
And
here.
you did this on stream, right, originally? This is way
Ah, I
back.
did. Yeah, I
Yeah.
did. It was quite a while back now.
But yeah, we had a lot of character concepts here while we were still kind of like hashing out what what the order was all about, what the Sublime Order stands for, and their technology and stuff like that. You can see which one we went for here with the a slightly higher level of detail on the left. Um, but there's some really cool character silhouettes here that eventually we might pursue for different characters because they've got some very interesting things going on.
This is supposed to be generally representative of what the faction is like. So some of these could become Steamhounds, some of them could be enemies, some of them might just be aspects of the world. Maybe you can walk us through what the idea behind some of these are.
Yeah. So the one next to the old chemist design is a kind of rough idea that I had for potentially Totem.
Yeah. I'm behind
'cause,
this.
I liked the idea that he's like on this kind of pedestal. Or like he has his totem that he actually stands on, but then he's able to kind of like either launch it or he kind of like it transports over to like the enemy tile, and then it would send like a vapor projection of him on top of the totem. So it's kind of like Wizard of Oz kind of thing where he's like the totem or the character himself is this kind of like very small kind of like character. He's very very short, like shorter than Ranger design. But then he projects himself bigger and basically causes the like doses to kind of like shoot out of the totem, like as he's like doing these like grand gestures. Like he's preaching on his tile on his side of the battlefield, but the totem is projecting a vapor version of him whilst also doing attacks around them. I thought that was a cool little approach to doing that character, and making the totem feel like its own character, but also like tying in with the church faction itself, and still having a direct connection to the character who is still on their tile. It was a lot to unpack. He's quite a complicated character to implement, probably, just because of the totem mechanic, but it's his key mechanic, so I think it's very like it would be very key whenever we got around to doing him properly, that he is very unique in his design and mechanics and visuals. So the second one, big guy in a kind of like another kind of preacher character. I imagine him kind of like he's just a very big guy in this kind of like floating kind of like pedestal that he kind of flies around in, gives out like mass speeches to people, and he's kind of got this like technology that amplifies his voice. Like he's kind of got like a jaw device that makes his voice louder. He's kind of got some megaphones going on.
Is it Baron Harkonnen?
It's very Harkonnen, yeah. Get the suspensors holding them up. Yeah.
I don't know that one.
From Dune.
Oh yeah, it's still
big old Baron. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you've got the Maiden Knight on the right. So this was kind of like taking influence from nurses themselves. Like they're almost like the front line of like hospitals and whatnot. So I thought it'd be cool to have this kind of like batch of like maiden. I think I called her like scalpel maiden or something. So she's kind of got this like massive kind of like scalpel sword, but she's like a woman in like kind of hospital attire or like kind of like knight attire. And again, they are the front line of the faction and defenses. So if people were to like try and charge in and try and like wreck the temple, these would be like the first people that were sent out. Then you've got Candle Guy. Candle Guy in my head was like the mentor for the chemist. So he's more like older in his like vapor approaches. Like he burns them, like he makes candles out of the substance that he burns, which create a kind of like vapor smoke fog like the chemist.
Hmm.
But the chemist found a way to modernize it and make it more like, I don't know, not toxic but more efficient on its like delivery service. Um, and yeah, Candle Guy, they've got a bit of a rivalry going on, bit of a mentorship going on. And then you've got the old Hag Lady, who was supposed to be some kind of what they called coroner. So I would imagine she was someone that lived in like the basements of the church, dealing with like dead bodies and kind of like figuring out how exactly the kind of like chemical and substances were affecting the human body.
I think that
Uh,
ties into another side of the order, which isn't reflected in the chemist, which is, as well as all this vapor stuff, they also do surgery, right? And again, looking
yeah,
back in the history of medicine, you've got all of those gruesome public autopsies and that whole side of thing, and we wanted that to
Yeah.
be reflected somehow. It's not just drugs; it's big old, big old knives as well.
big old knot. Yeah, yeah. So there's like again this. I'll keep saying it. The duality of this kind of faction, and they've got this like the one side that is very like Healy, and they look like priests. They look like clerics. They look like what are the preachers. But there is that side that's maybe a bit
There's
more
a bit of
hidden.
plague doctor in there as well.
Yeah, a bit of
Yeah.
Plague Doctor in there as well. So yeah, they're very interesting to design because I can pull these two like very conflicting ideas, but try and make like cool designs out of them. So
Yeah, there's an aspect to the faction that is a little bit more brutal, I would say,
yeah.
and like there's
Oh
people.
boy.
Yeah, there's an aspect that's more like practical, so to speak, with how they deal with things. So I see that with like the design for this old woman that I absolutely love. Just like cute little person with a lot of large cleavers and knives,
Yep.
solving problems and fixing things for the church in their own little way. That probably most of the city does not usually see firsthand. They're the people behind the scenes getting stuff done and doing things that can't be solved by preaching and their myriad of substances. So
Yep.
Yeah.
yeah. What
Cool.
else do we want to talk about? I'm just gonna bring
Do
up
we
a
have any
couple more
more?
images. Yeah.
Yeah, let's see what else we got. If anyone's got questions, now's a good time to throw in
Yeah.
anything on
Yeah.
that
Totally.
us to go into a
Yeah.
little bit more.
We can kind of talk a little bit. We haven't gone into this too much, but we had some other concepts here of how do the two factions right now, which are the Sublime Order and the Brass Pulse Coalition, how do they get along? And I think the answer is they don't. um,
Oh, oh boy, they do not.
yeah, so we're not going to get too much into the Brass Pulse, but I think a key aspect of how our game works, in terms of especially the single player, but also in terms of the lore of just the game in general, which is built into the player and stuff, is that there are buying competing factions for basically seeking for control over the city in any way they possibly can and getting a leg up. So just by their mere existence, the more dominating factions live in conflict with each other. And they all have their own private special reasons for why they want control and all of that sort of thing. But there's a lot of different ways that these factions can compete, whether it's economically, whether it's politically, whether it's purely by quote area control. Take from that what you will. Um, um, but it's good to just touch upon that there are other factions that have, I would say, equal control over this city, but in perhaps different ways, where the church is or the order rather. See, it's still even hard for me to stop saying the church.
Yeah. We've been calling them these names for like 2 years, and
yeah.
it's just like
it is so hard to like. It was like, yeah, just call them like, you know, the Sublimists or the Order or whatever.
medicists.
Yeah, the Medicists. Yeah, and I think that brings up actually a good point, which is like much like in real life, there's more and less formal ways to refer to certain organizations. And like the adherents versus the, you know, the people in charge. So we could actually probably talk about that a little bit. So basically the full name for this faction is the Sublime Order of Medicists. And like Jason, do you want to go into what the difference is between like the adherents versus people who are like part of this
Yeah.
organization?
So this is a church of some kind. So they obviously have like the faithful, right? They have the congregation, the people who buy into their whole worldview and believe in the tracks and, you know, huff the vapor on the regular. And people who are just kind of generally part of the faithful are referred to as sublimists. Sublimism is like the worldview or the philosophy, or, you know, that's the word for that. Whereas the Sublime Order of Menicists is more or less like the institution or the people who are in charge, and that might be shortened to the Order or the Sublime Order, depending on context or depending on who's talking.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sums it up pretty much well. And we'll get into the Brass Pulse Coalition at some other point, but yeah, so there's different. Yeah, I just wanted to like go into that because we've been referring to this faction in different ways, so wanted to make sure people understood that it's all more or less like the same faction, but you know, we could be referring to different people within. But yeah,
and the Sublime Order of Menicists is a lot to write down all the time, so
yeah, it's
we need to shorten that.
Yeah, exactly. What else do we want to get into today? Is there any anything else that we wanted to talk about in terms of the church?
I can't remember. Do we have have we gone through all the images?
We've gone through pretty much all of the images that I had today. There's some additional stuff that has to do with the actual campaign map, but that'll have to wait for another day probably. So we can
If you vote for it on another stream, then we will
exactly
go deep into the campaign map and gameplay and stuff like that.
Yes.
I suppose what we haven't really talked about is the like structure or hierarchy of the organization itself, and like how they, like the ranks and divisions within that. Like maybe you don't want to go super deep, Andrew. This was kind of your brainchild, I think. So do you want to give us a high level view? Because there's some cool little bits here, I think.
Yeah, there's some cute stuff that I kind of whipped up a little bit about this. In a lot of these kind of like more ritualistic kind of organizations, there's like great importance thrusted upon like hierarchy a lot of times in terms of the adherence of the organization. And so I thought it would be interesting to kind of like, when we were brainstorming this, kind of like figure out like how do we refer to these people. And part of the reason of this is because in our vertical slicer demo for this game, we're going to be dealing with some of these people in that single player section. I'm not going to go into too much more detail about that, but this was kind of like, how do we refer to these people of different ranks and stuff like that, so people understand like who they're kind of dealing with, because it would be bad if like we want to make sure that people understand like, am I dealing with like the head of an organization, or am I dealing with someone who's just boots on the ground? And how do we kind of like tell people, like how do we show people that? So in terms of the order, we have like a few different levels. So we have like initiates, who are people who are new to the order, and the church is not picky about who they pick. They'll take anybody and anyone. So like when you're referring to an initiate, those initiates are just as they come to the organization. So whatever you're called before, that's what they'll refer to you to, unless they just call you initiate, which is fine too.
Mm.
um, but as you go up in
Kind of rude, but
ranks, yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a selflessness kind of thing. Like it's less about you. It's more about like it's more about what you're a part of, I guess. And that's kind of mimicked as you go up the ranks as well, where there is a kind of original founders circle, I guess, so to speak, that happened like what did we say, about a few hundred years ago, probably. It's not like an ancient thing necessarily, but let's just say that the original founders are not around anymore. And as you go up in ranks, there's different job titles that you can have, and that has to do with your purpose within the order. And each one of those kind of like job titles, you have like a title for that. So you can be like a proctor or a steward or a predicant or a preceptor, which all do different things depending on, you know, what's expected of you. But there are, depending on your like your department that you're part of, so there's like different areas. So there's, as we mentioned, there's like people who are really into like narcotics, and there's also more surgical oriented individuals, and you also have like administration, and the very important thing for any religion, how do you collect tithes? So there's more there's like a lot of different areas, but each one of those areas was initially I guess like championed by one of the original founders. And so as you're going through the ranks of those areas, you will like your kind of honorary titles have to do with the name of those founders. And as you get higher and higher up, you lose more of your like personal identity, and you are less and less referred to as who you were before you joined the order, and you're more referred to as like by who you're trying to I'm trying to find the correct word. You're trying to like be that, like embody that original founder.
You're trying to
You're
step
trying
into
to,
the shoes of.
yeah, you're trying to emulate them basically, and in that way, like that's how the church like tries to, excuse me, the order tries to stay close to its roots, or at least appears to, um, by trying to mimic the way things were. Like we always, like we had these founders, and we will always have these founders, and we're trying to like mimic how they did things back then in terms of like what was important to them, all that sort of thing. Maybe that's what's on the surface and all that kind of stuff, but that's kind of, you know, how they're organized. So you'll have people, just like some names, like some of the founders, and this is probably another conversation we can have at some point about like how we're naming people, which is always a challenge. But you've got like people like Sadet and Kara, Cornelius, Archeon, all those people, and those are the highest level of people, and so they have the title of Tyro. Tyro's so you would refer to these people as like Tyro Cornelius, where these people don't even have like first names anymore. They just have like a title, and they share the last name of a founder, and that's how they're referred to, because they basically are supposed to be emulating that person at that point. So, there's some other rumors floating around in the city about maybe something else in terms of that hierarchy, where maybe that's not the entirety of the hierarchy. But we'll leave rumors as rumors. So
Good hinting. Good stuff. Yeah. There's also rumors about, what goes on behind closed doors, right? There's so much stuff. Like, are they surely some people in the order are researching things that are deemed to be heretical? Like, are they sticking to their own rules entirely? Probably not. There's probably more to their secret
Yeah.
R&D department. Who knows what? Yeah.
That might also tie into that might also tie into the chemist a little bit as well, because generally individuals who are part of these legal organizations, they're usually not Steamhounds. They're usually not freelancers. So for the chemist to be a freelancer implies that, maybe they're not, maybe they're not part of the order anymore, or if they are, is this like an alter ego kind of thing? But yeah, there might have been some friction with the chemist. But
Wink, wink.
yeah, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Say no more, say no more. But yeah, so that's kind of how those are seen. So what else do we want to talk about here for the church? We've got some more stuff, but I think that covers like most of the main areas of this church thing. So as you're looking at this image that I have up right now, there's like two major kind of monuments here, which is we have the cathedral right now, which is where production and ceremony happens. There's probably more stuff that happens there as well, but that's at least what's outwardly facing. And we have an area called the university, which is part of this district that is primarily under primarily under the order's control. So yeah, there's more things going on here than just a single landmark. But yeah, so there's other things going on here. So there might be additional like sub factions there, or maybe that like even though a lot of production quote is going on at the cathedral, there could be R&D in other sections. There could be an area for training for initiates, which would make sense at a university. But yeah, so a little bit of a look into the order.
Awesome. That was fun. I think we covered.
Yeah, we
most
covered
the
a lot of
bases there.
stuff.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. That's what I've been
So
doing. Or
we'll be
what
hanging
we've
around
been
a few more minutes in case anyone has.
doing. Any questions?
Yeah, if anyone
Ben's
has
been
any
hard
questions.
at work behind the scenes in this stuff.
Yeah. But yeah, just to reiterate, like in the vertical slice, in the demo, there's going to be, it's mostly going to focus on two factions against each other. So we're going to be working with basically the Order versus the Brass Pulse. So at some point we'll go into more Brass Pulse stuff. Before, like, we could probably do another one of these, only if people vote on it though. But yeah, like in terms of like follow-up stuff, there's some other things that we could talk about. So we have just like more details about the actual vertical slice itself, like the demo, like what you're going to be doing, kind of like big like overview kind of thing. We can also talk about the Brass Pulse Coalition as well. So that's the other faction. What else could we talk about, Jason?
What else did we post?
I don't know. What else did we post?
we could get a bit more technical and talk about how some things work on a technical level. Maybe that's interesting to fewer people, but that's an option, and we'll maybe put it up there. And if people vote for that, then that's something we can dig into as well. Yeah, if there's anything about like the process, that's also something we can talk about. But I think characters as well, right? Like we could potentially dive in and focus on some particular characters, or kind of do an overview of the 5 main characters all at once, possibly.
Yeah, Malieve, hopefully. Well, the thing about Patch is that we're doing like so much stuff behind the scenes that I think what we're most like looking forward to doing is being able to implement a lot of this stuff into like a I would say like dedicated inner circles, like demo access kind of thing. I think that would be a lot of fun to get some feedback on the development of that. But it just takes up so much of our time to work on those things.
Yeah, honestly, keeping up the fortnightly patch cadence has kind of been a little bit of a drain on our ability
Yeah.
to get all of this stuff in place. So
Just a little bit.
we're kind of trying to maybe hold back on the patches a little bit and just focus on getting all of this cool stuff to actually manifest in a playable version for everyone.
Yeah, we're so close. It's like we can see exactly what needs to be done, and once that's out in the wild, it's gonna be really cool. But that's gonna require a lot of like heavy lifting for a little while longer. So yeah, the patches are probably gonna slow down for a while.
Yeah,
just because we've got all this stuff going on back. So
Almost there though.
almost. We see the light.
I do still want to give folks an opportunity to play and have some battles and stuff, and we'll do minor tweaks. You know, like there's some slight balance tweaks and stuff related to commander mode that we may want to put in for next time. But yeah, we're still figuring out what the format of these streams should be. If you'd rather us just focus on the lore and kind of skip the battles, then that's also an option.
Yep. But yeah, so I think that's pretty much all we had for today. So I mean, we talked about this for a while, so I'm glad I'm happy with how this came out.
Whew.
It's nice talking to people about all these things that we've been planning and cooking up in our heads for a while. So
yeah, thanks. We're really pleased with how this is turning out, and it's all ties together and is kind of cool and consistent, we think, as well. So we're pretty excited about the lore and world building side of things.
yeah. All right, sweet. Okay, so do we wanna call it, or
We're coming up to the hour here, so maybe this is a good time to let's do it.
Let's do it.
All right, sweet. Well, thank you everybody for coming out and chatting and listen to us talk about Steamhounds for a while. So as we mentioned before, really excited to do one of these again. We're probably gonna have another poll up for the next time. So look forward to that and vote for what you want us to ramble on about for an hour and a half or 2 hours. So all right. Well, until next time, we'll see you.
Cool. Take care, everyone.
Have fun.
See ya.